Hi, I'm David Freudberg. This podcast derives from the Humankind Public Radio series, which I began hosting back in 1997. Our program recognizes how hard it can be, but also how necessary, for us to hold on to our humanity. So we've sought out people with stories that illustrate how they approach that quest. To aim high, to treat others as we'd like to be treated, to see others as more similar to us than different, to strive for patience and personal grace even in adversity, to be part of the solution, not the problem. We hope our podcast helps to reinforce and inspire your own quest. Thank you. Support for this Public Radio International program is provided by the Humankind Program Fund and by the PRI Program Fund, whose contributors include the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation.
The fact that a person is deaf and blind, of course, it makes people almost shudder if they take time to think about it. And then they go into a meeting, and there she is, smiling and radiant. It was a message of hope. People might say, gee, I wish I had as happy an outlook on life as this woman.
The remarkable life of Helen Keller, who rose above her severe limitations and inspired millions worldwide. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. In the late 19th century, when Helen Keller was born, a child with severe disabilities faced a future without the basic conveniences of handicap ramps, without much chance of a good education, without the host of legal protections now in place for the disabled. So it is all the more triumphant that this brilliant girl, who was simultaneously deaf and blind, managed to surmount obstacle after obstacle and to nudge the world closer to humane treatment of a long-neglected population. We call this documentary An Optimist in Spite of All, Helen Keller's life story. Sealed off from the world most of us see and hear, Helen Keller spent more than 85 years in opaque darkness and silence. A fever had wasted her eyes and ears at the age of 19 months. Never again would she hear a bird song at dawn or gaze upon the setting crimson sun. But the dual affliction did not imprison her. Although greatly deprived, she led an abundant life. Although greatly saddened, she broke through the clouds and found a way to gladness. Although greatly hindered, she performed far-reaching service to humanity. Her courage gave strength to millions. Those who loved and labored with Helen Keller remember her remarkable story.
Helen Keller traveled the oceans, crossed the continents of the world, persuading the powerful of the world to bring their influence to bear, to improve the lot, to improve the circumstances, to provide more opportunity for deaf-blind people and all those others deprived by force of circumstance.
There was one occasion, I believe, in St. Louis, in which the crowds were so great that they had to bring in the troops to scatter them. And, she was a famous person, there's no doubt about it.
I was with her one time when she was asked how many presidents she knew. She said, well, she hadn't counted them, but it was everybody's ever since Grover Cleveland.
Helen looked like the Queen of England. She had marvelous white hair, glowing skin, beautiful blue eyes, was dressed very regally.
She was a superior human being. That I knew. Because of her afflictions, and also because she had so risen above them.
She thought that the gift of life was given to us for a very specific purpose and that we had to make the most out of it.
The association that I enjoyed with her as a professional colleague and a personal friend has changed, I think, everything that I do.
Most of the time, people with healthy eyes and ears take for granted the wondrous gift of human sight and hearing. We scarcely pause to marvel at the miracle of just being able to look out on the landscape before us and listen to the panorama of sounds around us. What would it be like as a child to be stricken totally blind and deaf? Summertime 1886. A locomotive winds through the steamy American South, bound for Baltimore, Maryland. Arthur Keller, a newspaper publisher and formerly a Confederate captain, boarded with his family at Tuscumbia, their hometown in rural northern Alabama. Helen was age 6 and would recall the journey years later in her autobiography.
I made friends with many people on the train. My aunt made me a big doll out of towels. It was the most comical, shapeless thing, this improvised doll, with no nose, mouth, ears, or eyes. Nothing that even the imagination of a child could convert into a face. Curiously enough, the absence of eyes struck me more than all the other defects put together. I tumbled off the seat and searched under it until I found my aunt's cape, which was trimmed with large beads. I pulled 2 beads off and indicated to her that I wanted her to sew them on my doll.
The Kellers have come north seeking advice on Helen's condition. They are referred to Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone and also an educator of the deaf who takes an interest in the child's unusual case. Although she has the potential to be trained, Helen is in a crude state, with no language, no means of signaling her needs except for a few simple hand gestures she has contrived.
The desire to express myself grew. The few signs I used became less and less adequate, and my failures to make myself understood were invariably followed by outbursts of passion.
Imagine being cut off all communications suddenly after having been, a bright child.
Marguerite Levine, a French woman, was longtime director of the Helen Keller Archives in New York.
She was a very lovable child, and all at once she had no way of communicating, no way of expressing. At the same time, she was being bombarded by all kinds of feelings and sensations for which she could not get an explanation. It must have been the most state of deepest despair that any human being can achieve at any age.
I felt as if invisible hands were holding me, and I made frantic efforts to free myself. I struggled. Not that struggling helped matters, but the spirit of resistance was strong within me. I generally broke down in tears and physical exhaustion. If my mother happened to be near, I crept into her arms, too miserable even to remember the cause of the tempest.
The story of Helen's early childhood was memorialized in a gripping stage play, The Miracle Worker, later made into an Academy Award-winning film. The author is William Gibson.
Well, she took food out of other people's plates. She didn't, keep herself clean. Didn't keep her clothes clean. Things of that sort we do know about. I think that she was basically in pretty much an animalistic state. She had tremendous rages, of course, and by her rages she was tyrannizing the house, anything to keep her quiet, and this meant that she was deprived, really, of all the possible lessons of an educational experience at the hands of the social group, the family.
Helen's state was deteriorating. At Dr. Bell's suggestion, the Kellers appealed to the Perkins Institution, a renowned school for the blind in Boston. The school's director arranges for a recent Perkins graduate, Anne Sullivan, herself half-blind, to travel to Alabama and hire on as Helen's governess. Upon arrival, Annie finds the girl to be very intelligent and very mischievous.
Dear child, her restless spirit gropes in the dark. Her untaught, unsatisfied hands destroy whatever they touch, because they do not know what else to do with things.
It will take an iron will to tame Helen, but she finally met her match in the headstrong Yankee girl who has just arrived. Annie Sullivan was toughened as a child herself, while living for 6 years at the notorious Poor House in Tewksbury, Massachusetts, a dumping ground for society's wretched and depraved. There, Annie learned the cold realities of survival.
She was a fighter. I mean, Annie was a scrapper. She scrapped her way through Tewksbury and I'm sure through Perkins, and she didn't have much recourse. I mean, she couldn't say, I don't like this child and I don't like this task. She had no job except that. That was it. So she had to fight it out along that line if it took all summer, as Grant said. She began writing letters to a sort of foster mother she had, and those are the letters which then were preserved.
I had a battle royale with Helen this morning. Her table manners are appalling. She puts her hands in our plates and helps herself, and when the dishes are passed, she grabs them and takes out whatever she wants. This morning, I would not let her put her hand in my plate. She persisted, and a contest of wills followed. Helen was lying on the floor, kicking and screaming and trying to pull my chair from under me. She pinched me, and I slapped her every time she did it. I gave her a spoon and held the spoon in her hand, compelling her to take up the food with it and put it in her mouth. In a few minutes, she yielded and finished her breakfast peaceably. It was another hour before I succeeded in getting her napkin folded.
They're extraordinary letters, both by reason of the detail of her handling the case and by reason of her understanding. I've got to break her out of this prison she's in, and I think I know I can do this and I can do that, and it doesn't work, and then I'll do this, or it doesn't work, I'll do that. And it was that perseverance, that really the indomitable force in that kid. Helen had her own, but I'm speaking of the force in Annie, not to give up on all of this.
Gradually, Helen's stubbornness begins to give way. She is amused by a finger game constantly played by her new companion. In reality, Annie is forming letters from a manual alphabet developed by Spanish monks as a way of communicating without breaking silence. When she taps a fist into Helen's hand, it means the letter S. The extended forefinger means D, and so on. The role of Annie Sullivan was brilliantly portrayed on stage and screen by Anne Bancroft.
I think she had a goal, which was to get through to this, to teach this child language, because she knew that language was what separated us from animals, you know. And there's a beautiful speech about language. In fact, I can't even think about it now without filling up with tears.
I know one word and I can put the world in your hand. And whatever it is to me, I won't take less. How do I tell you that this means a word, and the word means this thing, wool, or this S-T-O-O-L means this thing.
We almost live in the garden, where everything is growing and blooming and glowing. I spell in her hand everything we do all day long, although she has no idea as yet what the spelling means.
5 weeks have passed since Annie first arrived. Everyone is astonished at the transformation in Helen's manners. Annie's techniques are working, and she insists on absolute control of Helen lest the family interfere. Then one day an experience would change Helen's life, from her autobiography.
We walked down the path to the well house, attracted by the fragrance of the honeysuckle with which it was covered. Someone was drawing water, and my teacher placed my hand under the spout. As the cool stream gushed over one hand, she spelled into the other the word water, first slowly, then rapidly. Suddenly, I felt a misty consciousness, as of something forgotten, a thrill of returned thought, and somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, set it free. There were barriers still, it is true, but barriers that could in time be swept away.
Annie had put more than finger letters into the child's hand. She had placed a key to knowledge that would unlock Helen's cell of sightless frustration and silent isolation. Once liberated, once free to interact and understand, the bright chestnut-haired girl would blossom into a gifted writer, a champion of the disabled, and an inspiration to all humanity. Helen Keller archivist Marguerite Levine.
The miracle is the encounter of those two women. That Helen could have gone her way, Annie a different way. And what a waste it would have been.
What did they bring to each other that in that encounter formed such a powerful whole?
I think a great deal of love, because I have the feeling that the love of her parents became very ineffective after she lost her senses, but that Annie restored that in her. And of course, Helen, as a normal child, demanded some love. And Annie was more than willing to provide it because, in spite of her rebellious nature, she was a deeply loving person.
At 20 years old, Anne Sullivan was alone in the world. Her mother died when Annie was 8. Her alcoholic father was unable to support her or her sickly brother, who would die at the Tewksbury poorhouse. In a sense, it was Helen who became Annie's kin.
I see an improvement in Helen from day to day, almost from hour to hour. Everything must have a name now. Wherever we go, she asks eagerly for the names of things she has not learned at home, and the acquirement of new words affords her the liveliest pleasure.
All my early lessons have in them the breath of the woods, the fine resinous odor of pine needles, blended with the perfume of wild grapes. Seated in the gracious shade of a wild tulip tree, I learned to think that everything has a lesson and a suggestion. Indeed, everything that could hum or buzz or sing or bloom had a part in my education.
Annie tells of how she let Helen have an egg in her hand at the precise moment it was about to hatch, so that the chick was born in Helen's hand. And it was that kind of experience that Annie kept putting in Helen's hand.
She wanted to teach Helen everything. Everything, because she herself, having been locked away herself in an institution for most of her young life, can you imagine the day that she got out? What she saw, what she had to learn? And this is what she wanted to teach Helen, was everything that she had learned. And she had no one to tell her how to do that. So she just did it intuitively.
I asked myself, how does a normal child learn language? The answer was simple, by imitation. The child comes into the world with the ability to learn, and he learns of himself, provided he is supplied with sufficient outward stimulus. Therefore, I shall talk into Helen's hand, as we talk into her baby sister's ears. I shall assume that she has the normal child's capacity of assimilation and imitation. I shall use complete sentences in talking to her, and fill out the meaning with gestures when necessity requires.
They must have just fed each other with their needs.
Must have been the electric.
It must have been every moment of that. I mean, they must have been so happy to wake up in the morning. Can't you see Helen? I mean, running into Annie Sullivan's bed, and saying, come on, what's this, what's that? Or, she must have wanted to know everything.
Whenever I give her a new word, especially a word expressing action, like hop or jump, she throws her arms around me and kisses me.
The bond of affection deepened between Helen and the woman she forever after would call by the name teacher. All the best of me belongs to her, Helen would write. There is not a talent or an inspiration or a joy in me that is not awakened by her loving touch. Through Annie's tutelage, the deaf-blind girl would master a rich vocabulary, would learn to write words on paper, to read Braille, and eventually, without benefit of hearing voices or seeing lips, even develop a halting form of speech. Years later, in this only known recording of Annie Sullivan, she would demonstrate with Helen Keller by her side.
The thumb resting on the throat, right at the larynx, the first finger on the lips, the second on the nose, we found that she could feel the vibration of spoken words. For instance, the throat, she feels the G, the hard G, G. On the lips, she feels the B and the T. And with the second finger on the nose, the nasal sounds, the N, the M. After her 7th lesson, she was able to speak the sentence word by word. I am not dumb now. No.
Alexander Graham Bell continued to monitor Helen's progress, and through him word began to spread of the amazing deaf-blind girl with a quick wit and a sweet disposition. The Kellers agreed that Helen could advance best as a student at Perkins, so at age 7, she and teacher relocated to Boston. En route, they stopped in Washington and were received at the White House by Grover Cleveland, the first of a dozen presidents Helen would meet. She basked in the limelight and seemed to have an innate talent for endearing herself to the famous and powerful. Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes would write,
"My dear, sweet Helen, it is delightful to find what a world you have made for yourself. You must have eyes and ears in your soul, spiritual organs of sense, which do for you what our outward organs do for us poor seeing and hearing mortals."
Among the many renowned Bostonians she would visit as a child, Helen received a lasting impression from her contacts with the famous Episcopal clergyman Phillips Brooks.
Only those who knew Bishop Brooks can appreciate the joy his friendship was. As a child, I loved to sit on his knee and clasp his great hand with one of mine, while Miss Sullivan spelled into the other his beautiful words. Once, when I was puzzled to know why there were so many religions, he said, "There is one universal religion, Helen, the religion of love. Love your Heavenly Father with your whole heart and soul. Love every child of God as much as ever you can. And remember that the possibilities of good are greater than the possibilities of evil, and you have the key to heaven."
A profound spirituality would pervade Helen Keller's entire life. It seemed to give her strength to meet the exceptional challenges that lay ahead on her path. Resourceful and ever determined, Helen set her aim on attending Radcliffe, the women's college at Harvard. To meet the entrance requirements, she would have to master classic texts at a time when few were available in Braille. She would have to absorb lectures she could not see or hear, relying instead on Annie's eyes, ears, and lightning-fast finger spelling. Helen would succeed in prep school, and in September 1900, at age 20, entered college.
I remember my first day at Radcliffe. It was a day full of interest for me. I had looked forward to it for years. A potent force within me, stronger than the persuasion of my friends, stronger even than the pleadings of my heart, had impelled me to try my strength by the standards of those who see and hear. I knew that there were obstacles in the way, but I was eager to overcome them. I had taken to heart the words of the wise Roman who said, "To be banished from Rome is but to live outside of Rome." Debarred from the great highways of knowledge, I was compelled to make the journey across the country by unfrequented roads, that was all. And I knew that in college there were many bypaths where I could touch hands with girls who were thinking, loving, and struggling like me.
The rigors of Ivy League education strain the endurance of normal students. Helen was forced to compete with them blindfolded, and at times grew exhausted. Annie, too, was taxed by the grind of translating for Helen many hours each day. Teacher's own eyesight, already impaired by a childhood disease, would decline further from the exertion. But there were also easygoing times during the college years. Some of the most delightful were spent in the presence of Helen's ardent admirer, the writer Mark Twain.
I told her a long story, which she interrupted all along, and in the right places, with cackles and chuckles and carefree bursts of laughter. Then Miss Sullivan put one of Helen's hands against her lips, and spoke against it the question, "What is Mr. Clemens distinguished for?" Helen answered in her crippled speech, "For his humour." I spoke up modestly and said, "And for his wisdom." Helen said the same words instantly. I suppose it was mental telegraphy, for there was no way for her to know what I had said.
Over the years, many wonderful people gravitated to Helen Keller. In fact, from adolescence on, she was a celebrity in her own right. While in college, the Ladies' Home Journal commissioned Helen to write her autobiography in installments. A book version entitled The Story of My Life was published the year before Helen graduated and has been translated into 50 languages. To the reader, she confides her inner struggle.
Sometimes, it is true, a sense of isolation enfolds me like a cold mist as I sit alone and wait at life's shut gate. Beyond there is light and music and sweet companionship, but I may not enter. Fate, silent, pitiless, bars the way, but my tongue will not utter the bitter, futile words that rise to my lips, and they fall back into my heart like unshed tears. Silence sits immense upon my soul. Then comes hope with a smile and whispers, "There is joy in self-forgetfulness." So I try to make the light in others' eyes my sun, the music in others' ears my symphony, the smile on others' lips my happiness.
The early years of Helen Keller, who, although physically blind and deaf, possessed the ability to see and hear much. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. Studio recording by Jeff Whitehead and Bill Wangren. Editorial assistance from Thomas Royal. Special thanks to John Corey Oliver, Wendy Sakakini, Roxanne Schroeder, and Bill Kavnas. Music performance by Mark Adams and Sue Shart. Our program is presented by Human Media in association with The Network Incorporated. Program development and support provided by Shart Media.
We're distributed by PRI, Public Radio International. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Humankind by phone, please call toll-free 1-800-5-LISTEN. That's 1-800-5-LISTEN. To learn more about this and our other programs and to hear selected episodes online, check our website, humanmedia.org. That's humanmedia.org. We'll give that again in a moment. Support for our program comes from this station and the Public Radio International Program Fund, whose contributors include the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Again, if you'd like to purchase a copy of Humankind by phone, please call toll-free 1-800-5-LISTEN, and our web address is humanmedia.org.
This segment, An Optimist in Spite of All, Helen Keller's Life Story, Part 1, is Humankind Program number 75 from PRI, Public Radio International.
To hear more episodes of Humankind, you can subscribe to our free podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or your preferred podcast player. A new episode each week. The podcast title is Humankind on Public Radio. And if you enjoy this program, be sure to leave us a kind review at iTunes and Stitcher. If you want to support the program, please visit humanmedia.org. And at the top of the homepage, click on How You Can Help. Again, our web address is humanmedia.org. Thanks.
Hi, I'm David Freudberg, the host of Humankind. People sometimes ask about the big picture of our work. Why do we present these programs? The answer is we're trying to cultivate a more cohesive sense of community, and our vision of community is based on personal ideals and values, such as compassion, generosity, equality, and civility. We aim to serve the large and growing audience of people who seek a positive alternative to media negativity and exploitation, and we strive to shed light on solutions, not just problems. If you resonate with this vision, you can support us at humanmedia.org and click How You Can Help at the top of our homepage. Thank you. Humankind is produced in association with WGBH Boston and supported by the Humankind Program Fund. Additional funding for this series has been provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the National Institutes of Health, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and the Park Foundation.
I remember when one or two of us accompanied Helen for that meeting with John F. Kennedy. She really got the ear of the president, and through that ear, she pumped a great deal of valuable information, and they responded to each other and they reacted to each other.
The Adult Years of Helen Keller, author, social activist, lecturer, and philosopher. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. The story of Helen Keller was powerfully portrayed in The Miracle Worker, the Academy Award-winning film starring Patty Duke and Anne Bancroft, that depicted how a 7-year-old deaf-blind child broke through the silent darkness and learned to communicate. But the events of Keller's adult life, which began at the turn of the 20th century, were no less astonishing. And according to friends and colleagues, Helen Keller comported herself with great dignity.
As often as I was with her, I could never quite overcome in the same room with her a feeling of her presence, almost ethereal. She was usually very calm, never angry.
Think of her as the animal child before her enlightenment.
Anne Bancroft.
Imagine how she evolved from that to this woman with the most perfect posture, this beautiful bearing. And there was always a smile, sort of, when she asked the questions, and then it calmed when you answered the questions, because she was listening all the time, listening to everything, curious about everything.
I found myself infected with her boundless enthusiasm, with her tremendous vitality and vivacity, with her vibrant good humor.
Interesting thing about Helen Keller is that how sensitive her touch was. Somebody told me that they were at a social gathering and a line formed up to shake hands with Helen Keller. And this friend of hers did it, and then when she left the line, she said to another friend, "Look, I'm going around again and see what happens. And immediately, of all of those handshakes, Helen Keller recognized her touch of her hand.
The hands of those I meet are dumbly eloquent to me. The touch of some hands is an impertinence. I have met people so empty of joy that when I clasped their frosty fingertips, it seemed as if I was shaking hands with a northeast storm. Others there are whose hands have sunbeams in them, so that their grasp warms my heart. It may be only the clinging touch of a child's hand, but there is as much potential sunshine in it for me as there is in a loving glance for others.
Of necessity, Helen Keller became attuned to aspects of life most of us overlook. Her ability to do so makes one wonder how much of the human experience we ordinarily race past without noticing. But even the acute sensitivity of some faculties could not fully compensate for those Helen lacked. Later in life, she talked candidly about her loss.
It is not blindness or deafness that brings me my dearest hours.
It is not blindness or deafness that bring me my darkest hours.
It is the acute disappointment in not being able to speak normally.
It is the acute disappointment in not being able to speak normally.
Longingly, I think how much more good I might have done if I had only acquired natural speech.
Longingly, I feel how much more good I could have done if I had acquired normal speech.
Virtually never could Helen talk in public without an interpreter. But the impediment did not halt her from speaking out on her busy lecture schedule or in print about matters of social conscience.
That's when she was fighting for labor unions in the United States. She believed in individuals' right to dignity. She did not like people living in poverty. She disliked child labor.
It was a time when children were working in textile mills at the age of 7 because they had little fingers and they were able to tie the warp of the looms. And she knew that women were working long hours. Sometimes women were ready to have a baby, were still working, standing up by the looms for many, many hours every day. She knew that the conditions in the mines were very unsanitary, that the salaries were far too low and unable to support families.
Denied much in life by her disabilities, Helen's period of political passion enabled her to join in the highly charged atmosphere of the day. Her radicalism was attributable in part to John Macy, a Harvard student who helped to edit Helen's autobiography. But Macy's greatest influence was on Anne Sullivan, 10 years his senior, whom he would marry in 1905. Helen graciously rejoiced, "Now I shall have 2 teachers." In rural Wrentham, Massachusetts, the 3 lived together happily for a time, with both Annie and John assisting Helen. In part because of the awkward arrangement, the marriage eventually soured and dissolved. But Annie wasn't the only one with a frustrated love life. Playwright William Gibson.
There was a time when Helen wanted to elope with a man, Peter Fagan. The story broke in the local press because they had applied for a marriage license in Boston.
29-year-old Peter Fagan had been hired as a secretary to Helen. One evening in her study, he secretly proposed to Helen, then age 36. His love, she would write, was a bright sun that shone upon my helplessness and isolation. But when the Boston Globe reported the marriage plans, Helen's mother, visiting from Alabama, immediately banned Fagan from the house. Archivist Marguerite Levine.
I believe that Helen, being a perfectly normal person, healthy, beautiful, intelligent, was entitled to know that aspect of human life. I believe he was truly in love with her and that she was truly in love with him, because he made considerable effort to keep in touch with her.
Mrs. Keller, who thought Helen too disabled for marriage, removed her to Alabama. But Peter Fagan turned up there undaunted.
Helen made a date to elope with him that night and sat out on the porch all night with her suitcase, and he never showed up because earlier the brother Warren had intercepted Peter somewhere and driven him off with a shotgun. So then they went back and spent these 6 or 7 or 8 months in which Helen's career sort of came to a standstill.
What earthly consolation is there for one like me, whom fate has denied a husband and the joy of motherhood? At the moment, my loneliness seems a void that will always be immense.
After a time of healing, Helen and Annie resettled in Forest Hills, New York. They lived off donations by philanthropists, as well as income from occasional lectures and royalties from Helen's books. But finances were always tight. Helen decided to accept an offer to star in a silent film entitled Deliverance, based on her life. Later they appeared on the vaudeville circuit, where Helen and Teacher would give a brief talk about overcoming disability. The presentation proved popular with audiences and managed to support the pair for several years. But Helen's rapport with the public would soon be put to better use. In 1924, she and Annie embarked on a railroad tour to give talks as a way to raise funds for the newly formed American Foundation for the Blind. They crisscrossed the nation, speaking before hundreds of gatherings and ultimately raising millions for the charity. The tours established Helen as a prominent national advocate for the disabled. President Franklin Roosevelt would write, "Whatever Helen Keller is for, I am for." During the Depression, she would use her prestige with federal officials to secure funds for the printing of Braille books and the manufacture of special phonographs by which the blind could listen to recorded readings of literature.
5,000 of these talking book machines have been made. This is one of the most comfortable ways of reading that I know of, and may be envied by those who have their own sight. The person who suggested this project and is responsible for it is Miss Helen Keller, not only the most outstanding sightless person in America, but one of the Republic's foremost citizens.
Established by the U.S. Congress in 1931, the Talking Book Program offers the disabled free use of playback machines and recorded materials. Here, narrator Alexander Scorby reads from Lord Jim.
Its way back into the lapse of time and was speaking through his lips from the past. Chapter 5. Oh, yes. I attended the inquiry, he would say.
Nearly 150,000 titles are available today in audio and Braille from the network of regional libraries throughout America headquartered at the Library of Congress in Washington. On a visit there, Helen Keller gave tribute to the Army of Unpaid Workers.
As I'm proud, as overshaded, so beautifully.
I'm proud to be associated so beautifully
with the work of the Braille volunteers.
With the work of the Braille volunteers.
That has brought such joy and light.
That has brought such joy and light.
To thousands of exiles on the dark.
To thousands of exiles of the dark.
Only they gained a greater degree of independence of circumstances.
Not only have they gained a greater degree of independence of circumstances,
but they haven't been urged forward when they replied in civilization.
That they have been restored to their place in civilization.
Through the power to read and write Braille.
Through the power to read and write Braille.
Lovingly I shall be with you, and all and often is a blessing upon either labors.
Lovingly I salute you and call down a blessing upon your labors.
Helen Keller would regard advocacy for the blind as her life's work. But the lecture schedule was especially wearing on Annie. In the 1930s, as she neared 70, Annie's health grew increasingly frail. Eye ailment she had battled since childhood left her totally blind in old age. In 1936, Helen's teacher, Anne Sullivan Macy, died. It was a blow from which her devoted companion would never fully recover. For a time, Helen seemed just numb. She had support from co-workers who had built a new home for her near Westport, Connecticut. And there was her secretary, Polly Thompson, a Scotswoman who would now serve as Helen's full-time companion. Little by little, Helen emerged from her sorrow at the loss of teacher. During World War II, she toured veterans' hospitals and would hold young soldiers who had been blinded and mutilated by war. Wherever Helen Keller went, her powerful presence gave hope to the disabled. Her British colleague, Eric Bolter.
From Europe in the west to Japan in the east, she traveled. From Iceland in the north to New Zealand in the south, she went, contacting all those who could be of help to her. She journeyed often, as I knew, to the point of exhaustion, but never, ever relaxing her efforts to ensure that a new and better way of life would be provided for those who were in need.
Helen Keller, one of the world's truly great women, arrives at Kingsford Smith Airport, Sydney, to begin an Australian-wide lecture tour. Out of her own darkness, she has brought light and hope and courage to tens of thousands of afflicted people. Stricken.
As guest of the government of Israel, the famous Helen Keller, blind, deaf, and dumb from babyhood, visits a village set apart for the blind. Miss Keller's visit marks a new era for the village. When she explains that segregation is bad for the blind, authorities act promptly. Seeing inhabitants are now being encouraged to settle there with the blind. For the first time since before the war, Helen Keller pays a visit to the people of Japan, this time as a guest of the United States government. In Tokyo and other cities, the entire population turns out to cheer this great American, left blind and deaf by an affliction.
Back in the United States, Helen sought increased educational opportunities for sightless children and vocational opportunities for blind adults. Throughout the country, state commissions for the blind would be established, often at her urging.
She didn't raise her voice. She didn't harangue. She spoke very quietly, very convincingly.
I remember when one or two of us accompanied Helen for that meeting with John F. Kennedy. It was certainly not a brief getting together for a polite exchange of remarks. She really got the ear of the president, and through that ear, she pumped a great deal of valuable information, and they responded to each other, and they reacted to each other. And I remember on that visit, too, she had a meeting with Caroline, who was then quite a young child, and Helen had the same effect on Caroline as she did on all children. All children trusted Helen.
Although a global traveler, Helen Keller's limitations ultimately isolated her from much of the world. Dwelling in utter darkness and silence, her daily existence was often solitary and interior, her life's journey an inward path. In a way, it afforded her great stillness and peace.
She had the enjoyment of the gift of silence, which I believe is precious to all of us. We need moments of silence. We need moments of reflections. We need moments where we can, be in conversation with ourselves, if I can say. And I believe that Helen had that luxury because of her infirmity.
Do you think that accounted for her heightened spiritual sensitivity?
Definitely, it did. The questions that we're all asking ourselves: where do we come from? What are we doing here? And where are we going? And I believe that was very, very much in Helen's mind.
The firm rock on which all of Helen's work was based was her strong, personal, religious faith. She knew and loved and trusted and toiled with people of all beliefs. Yet her passionate belief, that which motivated her Christian faith, was one of the biggest factors in the impact that she made on all people whom she met. She was not flamboyant in her religious manifestations, but I think that the strength of her faith was there for all to behold.
Helen Keller's perspective and mine, that here we are in school, and through our experiences, we are developing precisely in a state of freedom the kind of person we really want to be.
The Reverend Clayton Priestnall was spiritual companion to Helen in her final years. He follows the Christian teaching of Emanuel Swedenborg, an 18th century mystic who saw this world as preparation for the afterlife. It was a philosophy with special appeal for Helen Keller.
You see that everything that happens to an individual is the best thing that can happen to them insofar as their spiritual welfare is concerned. Each person is different. Each person has to be led in a different way and with different faculties and abilities. And apparently the divine providence saw that she could develop spiritually with these handicaps.
The difficulties which blindness throws across our path are grievous. We encounter 1,000 restraints, and like all human beings, we seem at times to be accidents and whims of fate. The thwarting of our deep-rooted instincts makes us feel with special poignancy the limitations that beset mankind. Swedenborg teaches us that love makes us free, and I can bear witness to its power of lifting us out of the isolation to which we seem to be condemned. When the idea of an active, all-controlling love lays hold of us, we become masters, creators of good, helpers of our kind. It is as if the dark had sent forth a star to draw us to heaven.
One day I'd been playing tennis in the morning, and when that afternoon when I was visiting Helen Keller, I said to her that I had had a game of tennis in the morning, and then I added, now when we both get to the spiritual world, will you play tennis with me? And she laughed and beamed, and she said, and golf too. I mean, that indicated how real the afterlife was to her. And she would have her hearing and her sight and could play tennis. And I think it's that knowledge that created a kind of unique radiance and hopefulness.
Most people measure their happiness in terms of physical pleasure and material possession. If happiness is to be so measured, I who cannot hear or see have every reason to sit in a corner with folded hands and weep. If I am happy in spite of my deprivations, if my happiness is so deep that it is a faith, so thoughtful that it becomes a philosophy of life, If, in short, I am an optimist, my testimony to the creed of optimism is worth hearing. A simple, childlike faith in a divine friend solves all the problems that come to us by land or sea. With this thought strongly entrenched in our inmost being, we can do almost anything we wish and need not limit the things we think. We may help ourselves to all the beauty of the universe that we can hold. For every hurt, there is a recompense of tender sympathy. Out of pain grow the violets of patience and sweetness. We invite needless suffering when we entertain an exaggerated idea of our own suffering. Why should we be spared the chastening rod which all mortals pass under? Instead of comparing our lot with that of those who are more fortunate than we are, we should compare it with the lot of the great majority of our fellow men. It then appears that we are among the privileged.
Helen Keller once described herself as an optimist in spite of all. Although hardship stalked her from childhood, and melancholy often came to cast its gloom, Helen repeatedly turned away despair. She attained understanding and acceptance, propelling her to great heights of achievement for herself and for others. The National Cathedral, Washington, D.C., June 1968. The children's choir from the Perkins School for the Blind has traveled from Boston to attend the memorial service for Helen Keller.
To them that are of a fearful heart, be strong, fear not, he will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap up as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb sing, for in the wilderness shall waters break out, and streams in the desert. The parched ground shall become a pool, and the thirsty land springs of water. In the habitation of dragons, where each man shall be grass.
Observers in the full enjoyment of their bodily senses pity me, but it is because they do not see the golden chamber in my life where I dwelt delighted. For dark as my path may seem to them, I carry a magic light in my heart. Faith, the spiritual, strong searchlight, illumines the way, and although sinister doubts lurk in the shadow, I walk unafraid toward the enchanted wood, where the foliage is always green, where joy abides, where nightingales nest and sing, and where life and death are one in the presence of the Lord.
An optimist in spite of all. Helen Keller's life story. You're listening to Humankind. I'm David Freudberg. Studio recording by Jeff Whitehead and Bill Wangren. Editorial assistance from Thomas Royal. Special thanks to John Corey Oliver, Wendy Sakakini, the American Foundation for the Blind, the Perkins School for the Blind, the National Library Service for the Blind and Physically Handicapped, and National Public Radio. Music performance by Mark Adams and Sue Shart. Our program is presented by Human Media in association with The Network Incorporated. Program development and support provided by Shart Media.
You can hear more episodes of our series at humankindpodcast.org. That's humankindpodcast.org.
This segment, An Optimist in Spite of All, Helen Keller's Life Story, Part 2, is Humankind Program number 76.
The executive producer is David Freudberg. Please subscribe to our free weekly podcast. The title is Humankind on Public Radio. You can find it at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all major podcast services, as well as through our website. Again, the podcast title is Humankind on Public Radio. And if you'd like to support our program, please visit humankindpodcast.org, and at the top, click on How You Can Help. Thank you.